many decades past the first years of the state. The fact that the Israeli right doesn't have a historical consciousness as opposed to the Israeli left, which has a very strong historical consciousness. This is the issue at stake. Because Ariane, who now wrote his book on the Beitar in the Warsaw Ghetto, he was Deputy Minister of Defense. Minister of Defense. He could fund research. I mean, how much can you cry about the left doing excluding Beitar? They could fund research, they could build research centers, they could give scholarships, and nothing happened. So actually what we see is it's less a conspiracy now than it is some sort of procrastination, or just, in Hebrew we say batlanut, like
laziness.
Laziness. I think it's much more laziness than it is anything else. And we can also say that the Israeli right today and the Israeli religious political forces have no historical consciousness, and they don't invest anything in doing history. So I think this is the story of the first years. You can interpret it this or that way, but it's certainly that now there's been enough years to correct this, and the fact that it's not corrected, it's only due to us, not to anyone else. And thank you for this interesting research.
Thank you so much. It's an interesting panel. I have a question to Mr. Keeda about Beitar. I'm not special this question, but a couple of years ago I watched one Polish movie, the title Beitar. It was quite interesting. It was popular movie. It's not scientific, something like this, but this movie was a lot of testimonies of members of Beitar, quite interesting. And in one testimony, this member in the United States, he described violence Beitar against the left. Ashomer Tzair, I don't remember what political group, here in Palestine, in Israel, before war. Well, for me, it's interesting, in these testimonies, how do these members of Beitar describe their relations with left groups, Ashomer Tzair and so on? So maybe Buddhists, maybe these political groups, Zionists and not Zionists and so on. Before war and during the Holocaust and so on.
Just let me tell you a personal story. My father was a communist, my mother was a member of Hashomer Tzair, and I wasn't allowed to wear the Beitar uniform at home. And I think it was both ways. Again, I was far too young to really feel the sharpness of it. But, and in faraway Australia, obviously it was a lot toned down, but there's still a great deal of animosity in both directions. But that sounds very interesting, and I'll get the details from you later on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I have a question for both of you. So, and thank you both for two fascinating papers. First, for Ariane. So I'm fascinated by this idea of the model reader, and sort of raise another issue as we go through the list of issues to consider methodologically when reading testimony, thinking about audience, right, and sort of the issue of audience and how the testimony or the memoir is crafted and constructed. And I think this issue is critical. You talk about sort of this idea of comrades in suffering, and this reminded me of a concept, again, to bring up Browning, that he talks about in Remembering Survival, that there are these, he lists 4 different types of memory. That there are sort of shared memories, there's public memory that can be shared with any audience, and then there's private memory that can not be shared with anyone, and then there are those memories that can only be shared with someone who was there. And I think this is a very, very important distinction, which you also point to. The specific question I want to ask you is actually another question about translation. Which I think is also an interesting one, that is sort of, what is the language in which one remembers? And then how does this affect the way in which then that memory is translated either to an audience, or perhaps, we know that Naomi Seidman writes about the issues of translation with Elie Wiesel's memoirs, but I think that's an important point too. For Peter, I think this is a very interesting topic, and I want to applaud, first of all, sort of the use of Yizkor books as an excellent source. I myself am starting on I'm not talking about it tomorrow, but I'm starting a new research project that looks at the early memories of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's immediately contested, sort of between different political groups, left-wing Zionist groups and Bundes and Beitar as well. And so I think this is a very, very complicated narrative that emerges during the war, sort of how this story is going to be told. Specifically, the Lachva case, I think, is a fascinating case. The Yizkor book, as you alluded to, is called Rishonim Lamered, right? The first to revolt, which is a great point of pride. I don't know if you've looked into who the editors were of the Lachva Yizkor book, but I think that would be interesting. And then in that specific case, what's fascinating about it is that you see cooperation between the youth movement that organizes the uprising and the head of the Judenrat, who gives the signal to begin the revolt. And I think that's a really important point, because this is a case where it's not the youth movement as an alternative leadership, but sort of the choice to engage in resistance and let's save as many as we can in this way.
About the issue of translation, can you hear?
Yeah.
That's so important when you deal with testimonies, and I think I personally work on post-war testimonies of people who wrote in their mother tongue. So that issue of translation is less present in the methodological questions that I have to ask myself. But it is very present if you go into later testimonies written by people who ended up in the US or in the UK and so on, and who lived 30 years in English, and they decide to write in English or other languages, and they write in a language that's not their mother tongue. And but to go back to the question of translation, I think any testimony is a kind of translation. Not linguistically, if you will, but I didn't refer to him in my paper, but a theologian that I use a lot in my analysis of the testimonies is Michael Bakhtin, and he says that the comprehension is translation, is a kind of translation, and that you make a parallel between something that you understand to make it understandable to someone who hasn't lived it or hasn't seen it. You have to use another parallel. You have to use a parallel to another reality that this person may grasp better. And I think that's what comparisons and intertextuality, that's what they do in testimonies. But I think that just the fact of writing testimonies itself is a kind of translation, trying to show a reality that's so difficult to evoke, and the survivors always talk about how they had to struggle through language, and even with their mother tongue, it's still it seems impossible. So, you want to comment?
Thanks very much about the editors. Certainly, I have to look a bit more deeper into who the editors were and their political orientation. I think I mentioned that this is problematic. Yes, sure.
Thank you for a very stimulating panel. I have two questions, one for Ariane and then one for Peter. For Ariane, I'm also I'm extremely intrigued by the idea of model reader, because it seems to me that the readers change, and as we're going to be the focus of the conference is the future of Holocaust Testimonies, the future. And I wonder whether the same model reader who would have been the reader for the people we discuss were the readers now. And I wonder whether when we think of how we, part of our mission, I've heard people say mission, shlichut in Hebrew, our mission is to make this memoirs or fiction, testimony, something alive and vital for future generations. How do we try to anticipate who the future model reader will be. I'm the father of children, teenagers, and they're very, I just don't know how to, their generation, those who come after them, how do we reach their imaginations? I think that's a very important issue. I'd love to hear you discuss that. For Peter, and Miriam and I were discussing this too, and Avi mentioned this. I wrote a paper a couple of months ago on, I gave a paper on Marek Edelman, who was the Bundist leader of the uprising. And throughout his life, he was struggling to make the case for the Bund's vital participation in the uprising. From his very first book, Ghetto Walczy, The Ghetto Fight, and through his interviews with Hannah Kral in 1976 and 77, he's always making the case. So it's not just Beitar and the left, it's a complex competition for, I don't know, the mantle of the uprising. So I think it's something to consider. It's the complexity of this.
To add to that?
Peter, I think the question is not so important why. It's very important now to do the job and the research. And I wanted to say to you, Gabi, that now there is a very interesting process in Yad Vashem. There was a very, very important diary that was written by a very scientific and interesting man in the Warsaw Ghetto. I think something like 700 pages document, original, that was written during the period. And Lawrence Van Baum published an article about this, and he asked how it can be until now, and he's now, I forgot to tell you, he was a revisionist at those days, and he asked how it can be that till now Yad Vashem didn't publish it, and to add to this fact that he was also cousin of Rachel Oyerdach, and they lived, because I read this diary in the archive, he lived in a very, very close corner in the ghetto. So the question became much more important. And there is a very real suspicion that maybe because he was a revisionist. It also surprised that Ringelblum, they didn't invite him because he was well known as a revisionist, and as one who can contribute a lot. I can't say now because I'm a little bit involved in this process, but this is the fact. But I told Lawrence, who was there 2 weeks ago with another situation, and we spoke about it a lot, that I think it's not important, this question. This question, don't know, it disturbed people that was on the 50s and the 60s, and I think we are now in another days. And I told Lawrence, do you know what? It's so good that it was not published when the Ringelblum's diary was published, because in this way it was a side, because Ringelblum and Chernyakov, of course, was so important. So now it will get the right place and the right honor, because it will be in a modern process, and it will look professional, and it will be good. So this is what I think. It's not important, this question now. Really, even from, we know there was a lot of argument, a lot of tension. We know all of this, but it's not the point now. Now the point is to see your result, what is going with your research, and to see how it was, and all the history and other aspects of this issue.
Yeah, thank you very much. Both of you. First of all, I certainly agree the complexity of the situation, but again, as I have a very partisan view on this, that's why I'm focusing again on my ability, my research ability, has to be focused, otherwise there's unlimited. As to the question of, by the way, I'm meeting Lawrence next week. Hopefully he'll tell me about the work. I don't know whether he will. I'm going to meet him about this Warsaw Ghetto book, which I'm having difficulty reading in Polish. But you're right. There's the argument about why is not that relevant. But I think this is the way to stimulate some more interest and provoke maybe some better funding, some better research in that area. And it's good fun to be controversial now and again.
Your question was about the model reader for future generations, and certainly since the afterwar, the model reader has changed, and certainly the testimonies have changed a lot over the decades, and for many different reasons, but one of them is who they were addressing themselves to. And in the 1980s, there was an augmentation of testimonial accounts because it was they wanted to counter the augmentation of deniers as well. And in later years, even still, they had kept silent to their children, but then their grandchildren would tell them, "You have to speak," and they were then writing their testimonies. So the model reader has changed with the decades, and I don't think I'm the perfect person to answer that question about the future of the readers for testimonies. But I think Eva Kovac replied to that question this morning when she talked about the Son of Saul and how it could. I think for the modern people today are very tied in with the media and the field, and I think that's what really touches their imagination. And in a way, the testimonial can derive to the image. And
so it's not so much the model reader anymore, but the model viewer.
That's right. Yeah. But that's just one aspect. Of course, there's many other things.
But I think also one answer to your question is we have two new model readers who are recovering different voices, different parts of the history that are actually expanding our knowledge, helping us to see things that were invisible before. And I think that's part of this process of the model reader becomes a different kind of reader and reads different things that were there, but we didn't see them.
Right.
So it's actually something to be hopeful about.
Thank you very much for you both. And concerning the model future reader, I think nobody will contest that Anna Frank Galilee is the testimony, popular testimony, written literary testimony. And in 2010, Anna Frank House followed the stream, the very huge stream that now makes teaches Holocaust testimonies or fictive stories via graphic novels. So, speaking about visually and text, I'm not saying this is the future. The future is plastic, I won't say it. But I don't know. But it's going, it's also influenced by the Anna Frank. They did previously other books, but this is so Anna Frank's. So I think.
All right, please join me in